Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now past the middle of our third season, and we remain just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we explore today on our show on chemicals, hazardous and toxic substances, and the increasing effects of environmental toxins on our health. Now, toxic substances and pollutants are materials that contaminate the environment, and they may cause death, disease, and or birth defects in the organisms, that would be us, that ingest or absorb them. Now, the amount and the length of exposure necessary to cause these effects can vary widely, but they have definitely been demonstrated to be there. Now, environmental toxins are cancer-causing chemicals as well as endocrine disruptors, both human-made and naturally occurring, that can harm our health by disrupting that sensitive and delicate biological system balance. In essence, they mess up the way the body was designed to work. A good example or a well-known example of this is lead toxicity. Most people today know about that. People, as I said, are generally aware of the potential sources of lead, such as old paint, chipped, cracked paint, and old pipes and things of that nature. But endocrine disruptors, which again, these are the things that throw our body systems out of whack, and they usually mimic estrogen. But they're found in many, many everyday products that we use, like some plastic bottles and containers, food can liners, detergents, flame retardants, many toys, cosmetics, and pesticides. Hazardous or toxic waste or toxicants is currently unavoidable in most cases, and it's potentially dangerous byproduct of a wide range of daily activities, like manufacturing activities of our toys and other things that we use, farming, water treatment systems, a byproduct of construction, automotive garages, labs, hospitals, and many other industries. That waste can be in liquid form, it can be solid or sludge, and it contains chemicals, heavy metals, radiation, pathogens, and many other hazardous materials. Even households generate hazardous waste from items that we use every day, like batteries, unused computer equipment, as well as leftover paints and pesticides and other nasty things that are in our garages. Now, toxic waste can harm people, it can harm animals and plants. And that's whether it ends up in the ground or in streams or even in the air. And some toxins, such as mercury and lead that we talked about earlier, persist in the environment for many, many years and accumulate over time. Some have been labeled as forever chemicals. Now, humans or wildlife can absorb these toxic substances when we eat fish or when the wildlife eat fish or other prey. Now, research has shown that hundreds of chemicals are capable of inducing cancer in humans or animals after prolonged or excessive exposure. Chemically induced cancer generally develops over many, many years and after exposure to a specific toxic agent. For example, one of the common forms of lung cancer may take 30 years to emerge after asbestos exposure. Now, according to a recent report that dealt with hundreds of thousands of chemicals in commercial use in the United States that they found that only a small percentage of those have been looked at and actually assessed for their safety. A recent report by a cancer panel singles out radon and formaldehyde and benzene as the major environmental toxins that are causing cancer in our environment and our world today. And also they say that currently more than 400 environmental chemicals or their similar compounds are measured or have been measured in human samples. That is, they have been measured in human urine, blood, serum, and breast milk. Now, this is a lot, but here today to help us understand this a lot more and to unpack some of this are Lara Adler. And Lara is an environmental toxins expert. We have Dr. Susan Buchanan of the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. And we have Tracey Woodruff with the University of California at San Francisco. And they are going to help us really just peel back this so that we can really understand what's all around us in this environment. Now, Lara Adler, as I mentioned, is an environmental toxins expert, and she's an educator as well as a certified holistic health coach who teaches health professionals and individuals and health-based businesses to better understand the role of environmental chemical exposures in causing or contributing to chronic health issues. Lara trains practitioners to become experts in everyday toxic exposures so they can improve their clients' outcome. Lara is a member of the National Association of Environmental Medicine and the American Holistic Health Association. Welcome, Lara. Thank you so much for being with us today. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, and thank you for inviting me to speak amongst this wonderful group of ladies who are all doing the good work.
Thank you. And Dr. Susan Buchanan, MD, is a clinical associate professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. Susan also directs the Great Lakes Center of Reproductive and Children's Environmental Health, and she is an expert in health problems related to toxic substances and other environmental hazards in our workplaces and the community. Welcome, Susan. We are so glad you could join us today, and did I get all of that right for you?
You did. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have with us Tracey Woodruff. Tracey is a PhD and a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences. And she's with the Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies. Tracey is an expert on environmental pollution exposures and impacts on health with a focus on pregnancy, infancy, and childhood. And Tracey has authored numerous scientific publications, and before joining UCSF, she was a senior scientist and policy advisor for the U.S. EPA's Office of Policy. Welcome, Tracey, and did I get all that right?
Yes, thank you, Bernice. It's great to be here.
And again, thank you all, ladies. I really appreciate you helping us out and helping our listeners try to understand this some more. I want to start with you, Lara. I want to talk about and tell us or kind of define or describe for us what are environmental toxins, where do they come from, and how do we most often come in contact with them?
Yeah, that's a big question with a lot of different layers. So environmental toxins, environmental chemicals are somewhat self-explanatory. They are chemicals or substances in the environment that can be, more broadly speaking, in what we would often consider like the external environment, so air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, industrial contamination. There are environmental chemicals that are toxic or have toxic effects within that category. Then there are certainly environmental chemical exposures that we are getting in our individual personal environments in our home through the foods that we eat, the water we drink, the products that we buy, the materials and things that we bring into our home, our furniture, our laundry detergents, our cleaning supplies, our personal care products. And these all constitute this sort of what's referred to as the exposome, like all of these places that we are being exposed to these toxic chemicals. Unfortunately, everyone on Earth is exposed to some degree. We are past the point where we have sort of pristine zones. We know that there are some of these man-made chemicals like PFAS compounds that are measured in the body fat and blood of polar bears in the Arctic. So we know that a lot of these chemicals travel, many of them are persistent, and we have legacy chemicals from decades past, DDT and metabolites of those compounds that are still showing up in people. So environmental chemicals is a very broad sort of category. It encompasses just materials that we are exposed to, many of which have toxic effects.
So I think what we want to be the leave behind before we go to break shortly here, but the leave behind so that our listeners can have a sense of what we're talking about when we say environmental chemicals or environmental toxins. They are things that are out in the environment around us. But I also heard you say, and this is a part where we like to make sure that we're connecting the dots for our listeners, where they're caused by some toxin or some chemical, but then they travel through and through our environment.
Yeah, and so those chemicals that tend to do that tend to be ones that are more persistent, so they don't biodegrade naturally, they don't break down, and so those molecules are traveling in wind, in air currents, in ocean currents, and those are going to be legacy chemicals for future generations in the same way that we're still dealing with legacy chemicals from the 1960s, 70s, and before.
I have to think that even though you're talking and mentioning the legacies, I have to think, or certainly I have to wonder, if there are not new ones being introduced all the time, every day. That's the nature of it, and we don't know, perhaps. And so environmental chemicals can be the legacy, but there are new ones too. It's a constant assault, it appears.
Absolutely. Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have good chemical policy as it pertains to reviewing, assessing, and regulating new chemicals that come to market. There's over 4,000 chemicals in the PFAS family, and only a few of them are being addressed one at a time. It's sort of this whack-a-mole approach of I'm going to look at one chemical as opposed to looking at an entire class of chemicals. But we get into this.
And I hate to cut you off, but there's so many to be looked at. I think I mentioned 400 at some place and then hundreds and hundreds that are in commercial use now. We're going to go ahead and go to break, and we'll be right back on the other side to talk more about the environmental hazards and toxins. And we want to make sure we get at a place where folks really have a common understanding of what we're talking about, where it is, and what it's doing. So we'll be right back on the other side. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsors, North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care. Practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on chemicals, hazardous and toxic substances, the increasing effects of environmental toxins on our health today. And we are back with Lara Adler, an environmental toxins expert and educator, with Dr. Susan Buchanan, MD, at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health, and with Tracey Woodruff with the University of California in San Francisco. Welcome back again, ladies. Thank you for being with us. And they promise to make us smarter. So I want to start now with you, Susan. In talking about the toxins that and I want to talk more about them a little bit later, because it really is important. I think the purpose of one of the things we want to end with today is to make sure people know what we're talking about. They have a sense of what to look for and therefore what they can do about it. But also to talk now about who is most affected by the toxins and why. And that's some of them, because there's so many.
Well, Bernice, as a population, we worry about children and pregnant women are both really high priority populations. Children, because actually there are several reasons that environmental toxins can affect young children and infants more than adults. Probably the most important one is that their brains are still developing. So infants are not born with fully developed brains, and those brains continue to make connections for years, and the age keeps getting pushed back. And any parent of a teenager would agree that the brains are certainly not fully formed until into the 20s, we think now. So when the brain is making all those connections and growing new neurons, if an environmental toxin gets into the body, into the bloodstream, crosses into the brain, it can really wreak havoc on things like intelligence, IQ, behavior, ability to make complicated connections in the brain. So that's one reason that we worry about children more than adults. Another is that children put their hands in their mouths a lot. So there are toxins in things in the home, like house dust, for example. If there's lead in the soil and it gets tracked in on the shoes, it gets in the house dust, or if there's leaded paint in the home. Some of the endocrine disruptors, you mentioned the endocrine disruptor group of chemicals that can mess with our hormones. Those are present in a lot of house
And
dust.
what is that group that you mentioned? What is the endocrine disruptor group of toxins or chemicals? What does that consist of?
This is a big group of chemicals that our body thinks are their own hormones. So when they get into our bodies and they can act like our own hormones, like estrogen, thyroid hormone. Dr. Tracey Woodruff here on the call has performed a lot of research in this area and can give us some more specifics. But they are in a lot of personal care products. So children are putting things in their mouths. They're getting dust on their hands. So the fact that they put their hands in their mouths makes them a high-risk population, too. And then the pregnant women, of course, if they are exposed, those chemicals go right through the placenta into the fetus and sometimes even concentrate in the fetal bloodstream. We used to think the placenta was protecting the baby, but now we know that most chemicals cross that barrier and go right into the baby's bloodstream.
Just wanted to add, I think the thing about dust that people don't appreciate is that dust is like a little magnet for chemicals. So chemicals love to get out. I mean, they get out of products, like flame retardants get out of your couch, or phthalates get out of the different products they're in, and they get into the dust, and then they hang around in the dust. So that's why some of the recommendations that Susan and Lara have are about mitigating. Sometimes it doesn't always work, but because dust is a haven for these chemicals, that can both increase exposures, like Susan was talking about with kids who are like crawling around on the ground, but also could, represent opportunities for like washing your hands to reduce your exposures. So, of course, we should really not have the chemicals getting in there, but in the meantime.
But I'm glad you did bring a point that I want to emphasize, and that is dust. So it seems like to me what you're saying, Tracey, is dust is the carrier, like water is the carrier of certain germs. Dust is the carrier of all the toxicants and everything in the air. It is the river of the air. It carries everything. Just like water, things will float up.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good description. I mean, yes, there's I guess if you think of dust all the way down to those little small particles that make up air pollution, then yes, you have that. You have it. You can see it in your home, but it is a place where chemicals kind of, they find or hang out.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that. I think a lot of people really just look at dust as being like a cosmetic, like, my house is dusty. And they think of it really only in that terms of being like tidy and clean. They don't consider it as being an actual vector, a source of continual exposure to these chemicals. There was a meta-analysis of house dust studies that found phthalates in 100% of house dust samples, and phthalates are one of those more well-studied endocrine disrupting chemical classes.
Indeed.
And those are coming off of our paints, scented candles, fragrances.
Indeed. And when our show we had on plastics pollution, they talked about how a lot of those particles can even be when you open up a chip bag or something. So it's all around us. But one of the things, like I said, we want to make sure that our listeners understand that dust is the carrier. It is not innocuous. I'm also reminded of how most of us saw on television over the last few years when they would show these enactments of how COVID spread. You remember the cough? And they would show, I said, aha. Yeah. I thought that was a good thing to see because it begins to alert people at a very rudimentary level of how things in the air go from one place to the other. And so riding on that COVID dust and cough is like there are other chemicals and other things, all the toxicants, and because that's what the COVID bacteria or germ is. It's in the air and it's being carried by the air. And there are many, many, many more things that are dangerous to us that are also being carried by the air. Thank you, ladies, for really helping us connect that dot and make sure we get to that point. Tracey, I do want to ask you, though, in terms of explaining to our listeners how and why environmental chemicals and toxins affect or cause or exacerbate climate change or rising temperatures or extreme weather events. In other words, how do these things that are out there that are also harmful to our health, what are they doing to that air and that environment that we're recycling among ourselves?
Well, that's a really excellent question about the connection between climate change and the toxic chemicals that we're talking about, because I think people don't really appreciate that there is a connection between climate change and toxic chemicals. In particular, the primary contributor to climate change, which is fossil fuel use and production, is also fossil fuels are the feedstock that go into making plastics and petrochemicals primarily.
And many cosmetics.
And cosmetics. So if you're making those chemicals, and we did mention the one phthalates, right? That was one that we've talked about here, which is a group of chemicals that are, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are well studied. They're used in plastics. They're using as a test tube. A lot of they've used to convey scent. They're using, like, you can have them in your new car smell, or you've been used in cosmetics, as you said. But those
all
are made
around us
from fossil fuels. Right. So, the things that we do to address climate change will have a win-win to also could, if we do them both, but also address, or things that we do to reduce fossil fuel use and its contribution to climate change could also be used to reduce the inputs into things like plastics.
And particularly fossil fuel, it's the villain in a number of aspects of our environmental issues. And impacts, because like you said, that's reducing pollution, but it's also reducing the input into those other everyday products we use. So what are the more, though, Tracey, which are perhaps more beneficial and harmful? Would that be natural or synthetic chemicals?
That's a tricky question, because you mentioned in your introduction, which was excellent, asbestos and lead. I don't know if you mentioned arsenic, but those are all natural. So it's tricky because some of them things that are natural can also be harmful to us. So I think it's one of the things you have to think about is, sometimes when people say natural, it's unclear what that means. And It could have things in it that haven't been tested or could be harmful. So I think that's something that we have to think about when we're talking about what does natural really mean. And obviously the synthetic chemicals are, as Lara was talking about, are a big challenge because we only know a little bit about a very small fraction of the 350,000 that are registered for use globally. So it could be that I would hypothesize that many more of them are going to be harmful, but we haven't collected that data yet, and that's a big problem.
Most of us think or assume that there is a big, bad government watchdog agency out there that is preventing people who make chemicals from making dangerous and harmful chemicals.
Right. I just, when you were also, your introduction just made me think the job. And so you look at the federal government, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is charged with doing all the things you're saying, with cleaning up, identifying and cleaning up waste sites, regulating air pollution, and they're supposed to be looking at chemicals under the Toxic Substances Control Act. I mean, there's a lot of challenges with that law, but there still is some authority to do that. Pesticides, but it is very minimal compared to the responsibilities they have, and that is one of the big challenges that we have with addressing them by the government.
Indeed, and they're always behind the eight ball, as it appears it's supposed to be in front, leading and guiding, so that it does not happen. Thank you, ladies. We're going to go to break now, and we will be back on the other side with Tracey Woodruff, Dr. Susan Buchanan, and with Lara Adler. Thank you, ladies. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show about chemicals, hazardous and toxic substances, the increasing effects of environmental toxins on our health today. And we are back with Lara Adler, who is an environmental toxins expert and educator, Dr. Susan Buchanan, MD, with the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health, and with Tracey Woodruff with the University of California at San Francisco. Again, thank you, ladies, for being with us. Now, before the break, and I'm going to go back to Tracey, I think you said earlier, perhaps, that you felt that probably the chemicals that contribute most to rising temperatures are those associated with fossil fuels, or are there others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that fossil fuels has been shown to be the most important contributor to climate change, including methane emissions. But there are some chemicals like refrigerants that are used in refrigerators, certain kinds of chemicals used in refrigerators that also have been shown to be a very potent greenhouse gas contributor. So pesticides like methyl bromide can also be, a potent greenhouse gas contributor. So we do have chemicals that can be greenhouse gas contributors, but I would say the majority of the greenhouse gas contribution comes from fossil fuel and related fossil fuel products. So certainly you can have attention paid to also your other sources in addition to your large sources. But I think, given the state of climate change and the impacts that we're seeing right now on us and on the planet, it just seems that we need to do something more holistically to address all these contributions.
But, I feel like we should say, how they say on the political shows, they say that in these elections, people say it's the economy, stupid. So I feel like we should say it's fossil fuel, stupid. That seems...
Well, I mean, and I think, it is interesting because you want to have solutions that are because you have to switch to a different economy. So while you're addressing these contributors to climate change, you also have to be thinking, what's our different energy source that we're going to be using, right? Because we have to go to a sustainable energy source. I know that in California, there's been a lot of move to electricity and to move to sustainable electricity and renewable electricity, and to move away from things like even, gas applications, all the way from homes up to, large buildings. So that's the kind of investments that we need to be making. And it is possible to switch over. It just takes investments. And, could be a win-win for economy. So
last thing on climate change for now, Tracey, and that is, what does it mean for human health? And that is, how is climate change affecting our health in terms of hazardous chemical pollutants and issues?
Well, I think climate change affects our health in every way. Right. So we have immediate effects, so extreme weather events, whether it's floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. And then we have the after effects of that, right? So a good example is in Texas, where you had one of those major hurricanes, and then it caused release of toxic chemicals into the waterways from the flooding. Katrina was also the same thing. And I think, that is an ancillary effect of climate change, is that you're going to have these either sea level rise or major events that are going to release toxic chemicals that are basically bound to the land right now and that people will be exposed to. And I just want to point out that those, there's a report that was done by University of California, Berkeley, showing that a lot of those communities are going to be most highly impacted are communities that are low income and communities of color. So you can have already, a double burden on those communities that already have other kinds of environmental challenges.
But increasingly, especially with things that have extreme weather events anywhere in the mix, that's coming for all of us and moving beyond the low income minority communities, coastal communities too.
Right. The other direct climate effect is air pollution, right? Climate change relates to air pollution, extreme wildfire events. I mean, we live in California and we have extreme wildfires, and that brings high levels, extraordinary levels of air pollution, some of it from trees, but some of it from burning buildings, which I would imagine, contains a lot of toxic chemicals. And anytime you combust buildings, it's going to create, basically unregulated hazardous waste incinerators.
I know, it's just scary. I watch when I visit California.
I see that, and when you see red outside your window and the sky's red, it's like everybody is going to suffer from that.
But see, that too is coming for all of us, just in terms of the immediate location of the fires, because we've had fires this season in Texas, and our hottest season has not even gotten here, and we've had fires out in West Texas. In fact, a couple of years ago, I think on season 1 of Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, and that was right during the awesomely awful Australian fires. And we had folks from the University of Queensland with us. And they then told us, too, these wildfires were coming for all of us. And so now skip ahead 2 years and they're in Texas. And even beyond the immediate geography of the wildfires, too, the air pollution that they cause and all of those chemicals in that air, all of those, that asbestos or whatever other building materials, that very much crosses oceans and seas and continents. So that affects all of us as well. But I just want to reiterate, too, as you said, because I think so seldom do we get a summary of the whole picture. And that is climate change is causing extreme weather events. Extreme weather events are things like the catastrophic tornadoes and hurricanes that we've seen in places like Houston and New Orleans and other places. And when they happen, they create flooding and other spillovers or spreading of these environmental chemicals and toxins in the floodwater or other things that those extreme weather events shake up.
I'll also add to that all of the flooding that's happening, whether it be from a hurricane or rising tides, rising sea level, is a major, major problem when it comes to water-damaged buildings and the biotoxins of mold. The vast majority of homes in the United States are classified as water-damaged buildings. Mold can have devastating effects on your health, and a lot of people don't understand or know about that threat. So that is just another aspect of how climate change is going to be affecting us.
Indeed, and I think they're getting it about mold, though. Susan, you wanted to weigh in on that.
Well, I just also wanted to make sure we don't forget about some newer findings recently of the effect of small particulate matter on pregnant women and their pregnancy outcomes. This was, I think, a surprise to most people because we think of air pollution and the small particles that are developed when you burn anything, virtually anything, fossil fuels, forest fires, whatever. They're small enough, and we assumed they get in the lungs. We found that there was lung damage. But now they found that the very small particles actually cross into the bloodstream. They go down to the pregnancy, they cross the placenta, and they affect the growth of the fetus. So now there are multiple studies that have found abnormal pregnancy outcomes in women who live in areas that have higher particulate matter levels. So now we know that air pollution from, and these forest fires are certainly making the air pollution worse, the particulate matter levels worse in many areas, are affecting, directly affecting the health of our offspring.
Okay, I just want to say it brings back up that point that they're also a vector of these toxic chemicals. So, you get to inhale these particulates and then there's chemicals attached to it, and that gets in, also can cross.
And that's exactly what I was going to bring up. You answered my question because I was going to ask, or let's make sure people understand what's in this particulate matter. What is this particulate matter made of? Why is it so dangerous? And as you just mentioned, it's because it has all those dangerous or hazardous chemicals and substances in it. And that's what's being ingested and crossing over to the placenta. And I have to think if it can cross over there, it can probably cross over to some other things there in our bodies, huh?
Like into the brain, like the blood-brain barrier. That's another area that's also, there's studies showing that exposure to air pollution could be also contributing to neurocognitive decline, or also studies on developmental exposures in autism. So, there's also it's a universal toxin.
And I'd like to add, just to kind of bring it home literally to people's homes, is, we think of this particulate matter as being a problem outside. how many people do we know that burn incense in our homes? There was a study that found that the burning of incense releases 5 times the amount of particulate matter that cigarettes do. They contain some of the same toxic benzenes.
Indeed, and then there's also, add to that, candles. I know I stopped burning candles, but it was actually the smell.
I know.
The smell was so strong.
And so these are items that we're burning inside our homes where we have poor air exchange. We don't open our windows.
Indeed. And Lara, I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to stop you. We'll come back on the other side. We must go to break, but we'll be right back on the other side to continue discussing this very interesting subject. Thank you, ladies. We'll be right back. And we want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body, specializing in periodontics. Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on chemicals, hazardous and toxic substances, increasing effects of environmental toxins on our health. And we are back with Lara Adler, who is an environmental toxins expert and educator, Dr. Susan Buchanan with the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health, and with Tracey Woodruff, professor at University of California at San Francisco. And they really are making us smarter. Now, I want to go back to Susan. Susan, you worked with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. Can you tell us a little bit more about that agency, what they do, and why they came into being? Because they sound important, and they sound like they're really protecting us.
The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is a very poorly named agency. It's kind of a complicated name. I keep suggesting that it be changed, but no one is taking me seriously. But it is a small branch of the CDC that was founded during the Superfund, when the Superfund program started. And the Superfund program is a large funding account that helps pay for and clean up the very contaminated areas, the most contaminated areas. And what ATSDR does is works with communities to inform them about the contamination, make sure that everybody in the community is safe. They will do toxicant levels in people, in the environment, in a community to make sure that as the cleanup occurs, that everybody is safe. And they'll also do some investigating in communities that are not Superfund sites, just to look into possible exposures in communities.
Susan, let me ask you, too. I know that you work there, you practice in the clinic there at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. So tell me, Susan, what kind of exposures do you see most of in your practice, and what are the health manifestations that you see of those exposures?
Well, as an occupational and environmental medicine physician, I see patients who have both exposures at home but also at work. So oftentimes it's workers in the workplace that have the very high exposures to the toxicants, and sometimes that's how we find out what the health effects are. So, and from a children's perspective, we're still seeing lead exposure. Not as much from leaded paint, but now from things like imported spices, some other imported foods, kohl makeup that is used by some groups that they put eye makeup on children can have higher lead levels. Oh, and recreational shooting. So bullets are still leaded. so that if you shoot recreationally in a range, every time you shoot off a weapon, there's a little plume of lead dust. So some of these ranges are very contaminated, and it does not take a lot of lead to raise a lead level, blood lead level. So lead is still a big player. Some of the workplace exposures include mold, like Lara mentioned. There are some health effects from water-damaged buildings. But we also have workers that are often cleanup workers that are exposed to cleaning chemicals that are causing reactions. We've got people working in steel mills that are exposed to all kinds of chemicals. A research perspective, I've worked with women of reproductive age and their fish consumption, looking at their mercury levels, because most fish are contaminated with mercury because of our burning of coal, mostly from our burning of coal. And so all fish has some level of mercury. Some fish have more than others. And so women can have higher mercury levels, which then crosses the placenta and can affect the fetus's brain development. So we do some work with measuring mercury levels in pregnant women.
Well, let me ask you this. I would say in the last year, what has been the toxicant or exposure or substance that you've seen most of in your practice?
Lead.
Lead,
Children's lead. And the reason I mention that is lead levels have come way down.
Right.
We took lead out of gas, we took lead out of paint. But as lead levels came down, our science has gotten so sophisticated that we can now measure deficits in babies in their neurocognition. I visited one of these researchers down in Champaign-Urbana at University of Illinois, and she had these 3-month-olds look at an image on a screen and could measure development by how long the child gazed at an image. So when you do that type of research, you find there are deficits even at these lower lead levels. So we're still very much concerned about lead.
Yeah. Hey, Susan, have you heard any of these reports? So, during COVID, people really upped their things that they were using for cleaning, these antibactericides. Some of them, they're literally overkill for COVID. So like these quaternary ammonium compounds. And I've heard that there's been cases of people who've using cleaning supplies or cleaners in schools that have gotten very high exposures and has caused, there are like respiratory problems, but also, these chemicals can also are also reproductive toxicants.
They irritate those of us with allergies too. I've attempted to go into buildings or even some homes, and it's been,
right.
For me, it was like almost just overkill with the smell.
And you don't need it for COVID. That's the thing that I think people don't appreciate. It's like even because it's airborne, even surfaces, you could just do soap and water. You don't need these highly advertised. Actually, Lara probably could speak to this. So I think it's kind of one of these things. It's like you can see these pick up in the your clinic, but
I think it makes people feel good. But I want to turn to Lara now, though, and if you can talk to us, Lara, for a minute, though, about what can we do to support our health, particularly in light of the exposures, so many of which are totally difficult or impossible to avoid.
I think that, we have to kind of assess the situation and say what's within my control as an individual and what is not. So air pollution, soil pollution, factory emissions, I can't as an individual change that. But what I can do is take a look at what I'm bringing into my home, what I'm doing in my daily life, and where can I start to mitigate some exposures there. So I always try to look through the lens of what's free and easy first, because a lot of times there's an assumption that if we want to lower our toxic burden, we have to spend all this money to do it, and it makes the act of lowering your toxic burden inaccessible. And just like Tracey was saying earlier, the most affected people are often low-income communities. So free and easy includes opening your windows. You need to let some of these chemicals that are off-gassing from our home items, furniture, et cetera, out. Air pollution is EPA has found it to be 5 to 10 times worse than air outside. Air outside is regulated, air inside is not. So open your windows. If you can afford one, get an air filter. That's on the investment side. Take off your shoes. We were talking about house dust and tracking in lead and particulate matter and pesticides from the park. Take off your shoes when you come inside. Ditch the scented candles, ditch burning incense. Those are simple places that you can start. Switch your household cleaners. Vinegar and baking soda work great. and are a great way
Indeed. We've only got about 3 minutes left to go, too. And in one of and I think this person will be with us next week, too, has mentioned that sweating, steaming, any way that you can excrete those out of your body is good. I've got one minute for a question for Susan and 1 minute for a question for Tracey. Tracey, you're on.
I just wanted to say that these things are all great that Lara's talking about. And we also need to have public policy because the burden is really on us, and that's not where it should be. And so that's why your questions, Bernice, about EPA were excellent, and ATSDR, we really need to have them be invested in so that they have the resources and what they need to do to really get rid of these chemical toxic.
Yeah. That's part of our purpose, too, is to get ordinary people to understand this, and then they can drive it by way of their conversations with not only each other and neighbors, but that conversation would filter up to those who make our legislation. Last thing, Susan, and what I want to ask you is, how have you seen or do you anticipate the effects of climate change on your work and on environmental toxins treatment? In other words, knowing what you know and what you're seeing now, and also knowing that climate change is exacerbating things, is there anything being done in terms of how y'all do things, how you teach, educate, treat?
I think one thing that we're going to see a lot more of is respiratory disease. People with asthma, people with COPD being sicker, more coughing, allergies, wheezing as the air gets worse and as the planet warms up. Because we know that it's the hot days, sunny days when ozone is made, ground level ozone, and that's very irritating to the lungs. So I'm concerned about respiratory disease. Asthma is very common in children, especially in cities. It is deadly. People don't appreciate how deadly asthma is, and it is an environmental disease.
Are you seeing a documentable increase in asthma and allergies?
There has been a documentable increase in allergies. Asthma, I think the trend, actually, I haven't looked at trends recently. I don't know, Tracey, do you know?
I feel like asthma getting asthma, not exacerbation. There's been a slight decrease just recently over the last couple of years. And that's probably because we've done a good job of reducing air pollution exposure in the United States. Well, it might be
the increased use of air conditioners.
I really hate to end our conversation, but our time is up. You guys have really made us smarter. We have been with Lara Adler, who is an environmental toxins expert and educator, Dr. Susan Buchanan, MD with the University of Illinois, Chicago School of Public Health, and Dr. Tracey Woodruff, professor at the University of California, San Francisco. Thank you, ladies, for really helping us to explore just a little bit, but a lot of understanding of this very important subject. Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week for more on hazardous waste and chemicals. Thank you.